I wound up getting autopsy tissue from people who died of severe COVID. Most people are running away from the burning house. I ran into it to try to get tissue, and then we were able to actually put some very sophisticated research techniques to look at what was actually happening in the body.
We can't get away from angiogenesis. It is very much part of who we are. But as you point out, there's a dark side to it because diseases can hijack this process and feed themselves.
What's actually happening in the body with severe COVID infections? And on top of that, which I really think they connect, why are issues like diabetes and obesity increasing the susceptibility to COVID so much? How is all this tied together?
Well, Shawn, you and I kind of start from the same plane, which is that we were all working on how do you stay healthy and how do you get healthy long before this pandemic hit. And so, a year ago when we got blindsided by this whole thing, and when I say we, I'm talking about humans living on planet Earth. Nobody expected it to happen when it actually happened. One of the things that actually, I think that, you and I shared offline is that, those of us who actually are engaged in understanding health dove right into the data as it was unfolding to try to understand why are we getting sick to begin with? I mean, the planet is filled with viruses. We don't normally get this sick. Like, we're not scared of viruses normally. We get a flu or a cold, not a big deal. But what was so special about this? And so, I'm a physician, internal medicine doc, and also a research scientist. And that's what led me to start thinking about health and diet and lifestyle. But, first and foremost, when I'm actually confronted with disease, I kind of go back to my wheelhouse to say, what's the physiology? What's the biology? What's the mechanisms of what's going on? And I'll tell you as a doctor, something that was really bizarre in March 2020, like when I watched the whole world kind of start to seemingly implode. Emergency rooms were filled, ICUs were overloaded, bodies were building up. And the thing that was really odd was that the coronavirus was supposed to be a respiratory virus. You breathe it in. But there was a lot more going on than having the lungs get filled up with fluid and inflammation. That is a big problem by itself, but you started seeing all these other bizarre things. People were having strokes. People were actually having smell problems. Their hearts were having issues. In addition to their lungs, I even saw kidney problems, and even the toe would turn beefy red. That is not your typical garden variety virus. Not even a serious virus was doing this. And so, one of the things that I dove into, literally into the deep end of the pool as a researcher, is to try to figure out what was going on. So I wound up, this is what medical researchers are able to do. I wound up getting autopsy tissue from people who died of severe COVID. Most people are running away from the burning house. I ran into it to try to get the tissue, and then we were able to actually put some very sophisticated research techniques to look at what was actually happening in the body, right? When you and I have always talked about health, we're saying it's not just about your lifestyle and your diet. It's actually how your body responds. That's the physiology. The clues are in there. And so what we found was really astounding. Not only did I look in the lung and find inflammation and infection, but I saw the coronavirus invading the circulation, the blood vessels, the vascular cells making up blood vessels in the lung. And as the infection was hitting the blood vessels, you can imagine what could happen. Our blood vessels have to be slippery like an ice skating rink to allow all those blood cells to keep cruising through, delivering oxygen and nutrients to every cell in our body. And once those blood vessel cells are infected, the blood vessel itself starts to be damaged. And what I, have once described as a smooth ice skating rink, right? After the Zamboni cleans up that ice, you could throw a sweater on the ice and go all the way across the rink. Once after a game, hockey game going on, you can barely skate on the ice at all. It's like clumpy, right? And that's what was happening inside these lungs we saw in people who had acute severe COVID. You couldn't actually get blood to actually flow through this. It was getting caught up. It was clotting. and these little microclots in the microvessels were happening everywhere. And suddenly there was an explanation, at least one ray of light that we started defining. And that's what was happening in the brain, in the toe, in the heart, and other areas. And so we published this in the New England Journal of Medicine to try to explain, at least one layer of this onion peeled back. And I'll tell you, we are still peeling layers back from this onion.
Yeah, this is fascinating. So this is really what we're thinking about, is that this virus has a tropism towards the lung tissue, but it's not just the typical things you would think as far as like a respiratory, cough, that kind of thing, fluid, but this is translating over into the capillaries. We're talking about our circulatory system is really what's causing all of these kind of downstream effects that, and just even that in of itself is, I think, really contrary to what people are thinking about. So and how does the endothelium really play into this situation when we're talking about folks with pre-existing conditions like diabetes, for example? Maybe this is starting to explain why diabetes and obesity makes you so susceptible.
Yeah, it's a great point. And again, it's an area that, as a researcher, I'm still working on. So we knew very early on that if you were an older person, or if you were obese, or if you had diabetes, they call it diabetes sometimes because they go hand in hand often. Why were these people more vulnerable? Now, they're not the only people that get COVID, but they were more vulnerable, especially at the beginning. And it turns out, if you correlate what we found in the blood vessels, the infection goes into the blood vessels, and even if you're super healthy, that will put you at risk. But we do know when you get older, and if you have diabetes, and if you are morbidly obese, your endothelium, the cells lining the blood vessels, are especially sensitive and not functioning really well. In fact, we call it endothelial is actually the name of the cell. The endothelium are the cells lining the blood vessels. But in diabetes, obesity, and in aging, we tend to see endothelial dysfunction. So you've heard of erectile dysfunction, right? So everybody understands that. Endothelial dysfunction is that your blood vessels can't get it up. And so basically what happens now is that your blood vessels can't get good blood flow going. And now if you add a virus infection on top of that destroys and damages that endothelium, you're in big trouble. So we think this is why the people with diabetes, even pre-diabetes, who are overweight or obese and older, are particularly vulnerable. It's not the only reason, but it's clearly one of the smoking guns.
This is incredible. So, and of course, this is why I'm so excited, because not only do you understand some of the root cause, like really looking at what's happening with our biology, but also looking at how we can, in no better terms, what are the nutrients and foods involved to basically provide some Viagra for our endothelium. So we're going to get into that in a moment, but I really want to dive a little bit deeper here, because I think first and foremost, especially talking with someone like yourself, there's a lot of points of contact with viruses. Like you mentioned, we have more virus particles on planet Earth than literally anything else. We're just swimming in virus particles. But we're constantly interacting with them and even sampling them. And I think that, especially when you see a lot of folks who don't have symptoms, or, maybe they don't even take the infection on, like, how is that happening? And I think there's one of those inception points, or interception points, should I say, kind of like Deion Sanders coming in and blocking the reception of the virus interacting with your cells, is our nose, for example. And so can we talk a little bit about that? What do you think about that?
Yeah, well, so even though viruses are too small for us to see, we are literally, when we step outside of our house or even in our houses, we are actually walking through clouds of viruses. And viruses are also inside our body. And just like bacteria, we've got good bacteria, got bad bacteria. There's viruses that are actually not harming us and probably helping us. In fact, the term microbiome, everybody thinks about good bacteria and bad bacteria, but there's also a microvirome that lives inside us as well. We basically don't understand it, but my guess is that, we depend on viruses that can, continuously interact with our bodies, trigger interactions that actually help, frankly, stimulate our health is probably the way it goes. And there may be even um, interactions or reactions by the viruses that live in a harmless way inside us that might actually even benefit the body. So I think all this, there's like a black box ahead of us that this pandemic has now opened our eyes to. We need to look into it. We always think about, like the bad guys, but I tend to think about like, well, what are the good guys doing too? If you had more good guys than bad guys, you tend to have an orderly society.
And what makes bad guys go bad?
Exactly.
As well, there's usually a story behind it. So in talking about this point specifically, that it's kind of like, I think a good analogy would be our bodies quote sampling a virus or bacteria from the environment, and it's happening with our points of contact, being our skin, our nose, but primarily I think our respiratory organs, especially those kind of front-facing parts, so our mouth and our nose. So is there a potential for example, having healthy sinuses or just healthy functioning of the nose, for example, playing a role in stopping an infection in the first place? Like, why are some people not getting infected?
Yeah, well, so, I think that this sampling and ballet, maybe it's more of a tango that goes on at the interface between the air we breathe in and our body is being monitored, moderated, emceed by our immune system, right? And even though everybody talks about the immune system, I think one of the things we've learned from this pandemic is that our immune system is much more complicated than we ever thought. And so what I've been trying to explain to people is our immune system is like an army of super soldiers. And like soldiers, every group within these armed forces have their own weapons, their own skill set, their own fighting skill set, and they report their own commanders. At the end of the day, the different branches, Army, Navy, Marines, and then the subgroups, the SEALs, the Rangers, they all, at the end of the day, are all fighting on the same team, and that's team me or team you, a team body, right? So what's happening is that when we actually have good sentries, these are the guards that are just sitting there waiting to, with binoculars, like our immune system, in our noses, in our mouths. And by the way, I want to also point out, because I do research on the eye, when our eyes are open, we got a lot of sensing going on right by the skin, the conjunctiva. We tend to think about the eyes just receiving light, but it's also sensing the atmosphere around us, which is why when there's a lot of pollen, you rub your eyes. And so there's all kinds of sensors right face forward, exactly what you're talking about. And we've got antibodies, and we've got immune cells, our innate immunity that's sitting right there, the front gates. This is the front gate of our defenses are one of the intermediators, the guard, the sentry that actually samples who's come to the gate and decides if they like them or not. Let me see your passport, right? And so passport control, our TSA, Homeland Security of the body, actually is that very front gate. Now, when we talk about the super soldiers, if once you let, it's kind of like going through passport control. Once you go through your passport, you keep on going, there's still more cops on the other side. There's still more security on the other side checking you out, making sure you're doing all the right things. And I think that's what also happening in the body is that most of the bad viruses and bacteria are held at bay, no entry, banned. Okay, or we got to take you off to the side and tackle you, and that's basically how this front gate innate immune system works. Our antibodies, we've got IgA, immunoglobulin A, which is one of the different types of antibodies our body makes. They're nonspecific. They are just sitting there, armed and ready to take down a virus or a bacteria that might be coming up, and they just are looking for any kind of bad guys that need to stay out of the body.
I love that so much. So we want a good security system, of course. And I love that you pointed this. That's such a great analogy of having the different pieces of the armed forces. One of those being that front-facing portion, one of those being where, today we know the vast majority of our immune system is hanging out in our gut and our gastrointestinal tract, for example. That's another point of contact and work. And so definitely we're going to talk more about that. But I just want to reiterate this again, because we're experiencing something incredibly challenging right now. But this isn't the last thing. We're continuously going to be exposed to novel viruses, novel strains of bacteria. And ultimately, of course, the place that we're really trying to get to today, and why I'm having Dr. Lee on and so excited about this, is getting our citizens more resilient for what is definitely imminent. And so just to reiterate this point again, you mentioned we have this virome, this microvirome, the human virome. We have over 400 trillion viruses in and on our bodies right now. And some of them are pathogenic, like they can make us sick. But also, again, this got me back into the data early on, looking at the human genome itself, when that was mapped out and all the surprises that came from that. We just thought we would have so many different genes, especially like compared to, flies and things like that. But we come to find out we've got like 20,000-ish genes that we're all sharing, but we have this dramatically incredible array of epigenetic influences that can change what our genes do so much, making us so different in our appearance, making us so different in our performance and our health. And one of those big pieces I saw in the Human Genome Project, 8% of the human genome itself is endogenous retroviruses. So when Dr. Lee is stating the fact that this is a part of us, that in some ways viruses help us, but in other ways, we do have these experiences of having new things that we have to adapt to, and we need to get ourselves to a better place for us to adapt. So with this said, I want to talk about this intersection point of the gut and our food and how that might play a part in our susceptibility. And specifically, you talk about something in your incredible book, New York Times bestseller, Eat to Beat Disease, the body's defense systems. So can you talk about what that is, the body's defense systems, the body's health defense systems, and how activating these systems can really help in situations like this and everything else in our lives that we're challenged with?
Yeah, you're so right, Shawn. This isn't the first mass illness that we have to deal with. There's others coming. But even before we were even talking about coronaviruses, we were talking about cancer, heart disease, diabetes, arthritis, dementia, and Alzheimer's, a number of autoimmune diseases, all these other things. Listen, I went to medical school. I spent, 4 years memorizing thick textbooks of every single disease has been discovered in over 4,000 years of Western medicine. The one thing they never taught us actually how to do, that I actually formed the body of my work, is that so as a doctor, you're trained to ask, okay, what causes the disease? What's going on with the disease? But I wound up actually building my career asking the question, why don't we get sick more often? Why don't we get sick more often, right? So that's the way of answering the question, what is health? If health is what? If you ask most people, health is the absence of disease. I'm not sick. How do you know you're healthy? Because I'm not sick. Well, okay, so then what is health? Not being sick? That's not a very satisfactory answer. And if you're really operationalizing it, you can't operationalize a negative. You can't do something about the absence of something else, right? Really, it kind of twists your mind when you think about that. So I started asking, well, what is health? Well, health, if it's not the absence or not only the absence of disease, what is it the result of? Our health, is what my research has shown, is a result of our body's hardwired health defense systems that we're born with. They formed in the womb. When we were developing in the uterus, in our mom's uterus, we were forming these health defense systems that stay with us from the time we're born to our very last breath. Even when you're dying, your health defenses are still trying to resist disease. So now, turn it right back to that question. How come we don't get sick more often? It leads your mind to go think something else. Like, yeah, that's a really good question. Let me throw a couple of kind of like examples of why that question matters. So we know cigarette smoke causes lung cancer. And how many of us has breathed cigarette smoke coming out of a bar or a restaurant or a bus stop, And that cigarette smoke went into our lungs. And how come we didn't develop lung cancer ourselves, right? I mean, it's not like, oh, yeah, the smoker's going to develop it, but how come we didn't? We breathed it. When you're actually out at the beach, we know that bright sunshine, sunlight, ultraviolet radiation could cause skin cancer. So almost all of us have gone out and laid out in the sun. Our skin darkens, our pigment darkens, we get a tan. Now, how come we didn't get skin cancer? I mean, yeah, sure, people that burn do get skin cancer. That's an explanation. But how come the rest of us didn't get that skin cancer? That wound up becoming the body of my work. And one of the things that I wrote about in my book, Eat to Beat Disease, is, and this is the subtitle of the book, the new science of how your body defends itself. Okay, and how do we do this? We do this with 5 health defense systems. It's probably more than 5, but I'll tell you, 5 is what keeps us alive. And it's angiogenesis, our circulation keeps us alive. Without a good, healthy circulation, we die, because our blood vessel network, we talked about endothelial cells, actually bring oxygen and nutrients to every single cell and organ of our body. So we got to keep that in perfect shape, and foods can boost that. Number 2, our stem cells. Now, when we were only an egg plus sperm and fertilized into an ovum and started to develop into, this early cluster of living cells, we were all made out of stem cells. And as we got turned into a human, a human being, looked like an arm and a leg, a couple of eyes, and we were born, we kept some of those stem cells around. Where are they? They're in our skin. They're in our bone marrow. They're even in our hearts and our brains, we now figured out. And the fact is that when we're adults, those stem cells defend us against disease because they repair damaged organs. We don't even know the damage that goes on in our organs, and these invisibly come out, and behind, while we're sleeping, they're coming out, and they're actually repairing, our damaged goods. Our microbiome, which we started talking about already, defends our health. Our DNA, and everybody thinks about DNA as our genetic code. It's not like it's a Rosetta Stone and you just kind of read through the code. No, man, our DNA is active. It's dynamic. It's changing. You talked about the viral integration in the DNA. Our DNA is about as alive as you can think about it, like an octopus, in an aquarium. It's doing all kinds of things. And one of the things it's doing is dividing, replacing itself. But our DNA makes 10,000 mistakes every single day in the typical human body, and each of those mistakes can lead to a cancer. So how come we don't develop cancer all the time? Because our DNA fixes these mistakes. It's got its own spell check. It can actually look for the typos and fix them automatically. It's got its own, when there's big damage, like not just single letters that are misspelled, not just misspellings, but big chunks that are damaged. Think about that the last time you went out and got really burned in your skin. And I'm not talking about sunburn now. I'm talking about like a candle burn, an oil burn, something in the kitchen maybe. Now think of all the mutations that occurred with that injury. Okay. Well, guess what? It knows how to repair those potholes. It can fix it. And as we age, our DNA naturally is at risk for more damaging because the telomeres that protect the caps of our DNA burn down like the candle itself. I call it a life fuse. When that fuse burns down, you're right at the powder keg. And bottom line is that we can actually slow down that burning with food and fix the DNA with food. And then back to home base, what we just talked about is our immune system. It turns out our immune system is our final defense system that I wrote about. Angiogenesis, stem cells, microbiome, DNA, and immunity. These are 5 legs of the stool of our health. We sit on this. This is what props us up every single day that keeps us from getting sick more often.
Powerful. This is so good. So powerful. So I got to ask you about a couple of things before we dive into what are some of the things that we can help to do to kind of support our health defense systems. I want to ask you about vascular endothelial growth factor, aka VEGF. This might be a new term for a lot of folks, but when talking about the endothelial component of this, it just really got my wheels turning. and how this might be playing a role here. So can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. So first of all, VEGF sounds like a superpower, right? Like, a Marvel universe, right? And it's like, so, and actually it is kind of one of the body's natural super healing proteins. So we got a lot of proteins in our body, and we haven't researched them all, but we know some of them are super important, like insulin's really important, thyroid hormone. These are all proteins. VEGF, vascular endothelial growth factor, is one of the more recent discoveries. Now, I got to confess something, which is I was working in the lab that first discovered VEGF. And this was, so many years ago, I don't even want to talk about it, but we were hunting for this invisible factor that we knew if we had blood vessels growing in a plastic dish, if there was a drop of this substance X that was in there, that's how we thought about it. We knew that the moment that drop hit it, it would be like, imagine a video of this, like a drop coming down, hitting the water, causing that ripple effect. And once that drop got in there, blood vessels would be activated, and a single blood vessel would start to branch out, sprout. You'd get a whole spider web that would come out of a single drop of this VEGF. It took time to figure it out, but here's what it is. It is the body's natural blood vessel growing factor. Vascular endothelium are the cells lining blood vessels. This is the growth factor that causes them, it tells them, hey, wake up, dudes, time to go to work. Okay? It is like that, that alarm in the morning. That's what VEGF is, and it gives very specific instructions. It doesn't just wake them up; it actually tells them exactly what to do. And they sprout, they divide, they extend, they form arcades, beautiful arcades, and they start from thick blood vessels down to skinny ones. The thick ones, we have the biggest blood vessel in our body is called the aorta. It's the big one that pumps blood. We got two big ones in our neck, carotid arteries, But the amazing ones are the ones that are harder to see. They're smaller than a human hair, okay? And we have 19 billion of those things. And those are actually what bleeds when we cut ourselves, even a paper cut. You're not cutting a big artery. You're not jetting blood out. But that blood that comes up when you get a paper cut, that's because you cut through some of those 19 billion capillaries. That's actually what keeps us alive. So VEGF is a great thing until it's a bad thing. And it can be a bad thing in some diseases like cancer, those mutations that our body can't repair enough, which is why we want to eat foods that can help our body protect the good blood vessels and not the bad ones. When cancers actually start without a blood supply because of mutations, they can't grow bigger than the head of a ballpoint pen. Let me see if I can see a ballpoint pen around here. I can show just how big it is. Well, this isn't really a ballpoint pen, but you can kind of see this is a pen. That little tip there, that little nub, that's it. That's how big a cancer can get without oxygen. But a few of these cancer cells can figure out how to hijack our vascular system and selfishly grow blood vessels to it, right? It's like a bank robber going in there to bust out some cash. Well, how does a cancer do this? It copy pastes VEGF. It learns how to actually make the healing factor, and instead of healing, it drops some of that good stuff to wake up the vascular endothelial cells, the blood vessels, and the vessels are tricked into feeding the cancer instead. And the moment that blood vessels touch that little nub that couldn't grow without a blood supply, we've done research to show once angiogenesis or blood vessels touch a tumor, a tiny little tumor can grow 16,000 times in size in 2 weeks. So this is the trigger for tumor growth. Without angiogenesis, without VEGF, tumors are essentially harmless.
Oh my goodness, this is fascinating. What in the world got you into this field? What got you interested initially? I'm talking like when you're a kid, deciding on what you're going to go to school for. What got you interested in health and wellness in the first place?
Well, when we're kids, we're all running around and, physically active. And I happened to grow up in an environment where, food was an important part of my life growing up. And we always had fresh food done with nice ingredients. It was always tasty. I remember, coming home from school and just smelling what was coming out of the kitchen. It was really what I associate with my home. And later on, I went to medical school, and I knew that I wanted to be a doctor to help people. And pretty quickly, I realized that everything that we were being taught, Shawn, was about diagnosing diseases and prescribing medicines, which, look, as a doctor, that's really important. I've seen firsthand how important medicines can be, life-saving in many cases. But really, I think as I've gotten on with my career, and I've helped to develop 30-some FDA-approved treatments, I started realizing the bigger challenge, the bigger opportunity and challenge for us is really to prevent disease in the first place. The moment you start talking about prevention, you can't be talking about medicines anymore. You have to talk about food. It's a different tool in the toolbox. Yeah. And I started to realize that all the research and all the science that I had looking at medicines has not yet been applied to food. And that's what I really wrote my book, Eat to Beat Disease about, is what's the science behind how the body heals itself? Because when it comes to our food and health, it's not just about the food. It's about how our body responds to what we put inside it.
Yeah, absolutely. I love that so much. And, just hearing a little bit of your story and how this kind of progressed, I went to traditional university, and going pre-med, it wasn't even required for me to take anything regarding nutrition, which at the time I didn't think anything about it. But now looking back, it's just really shocking because food really is what we make our bodies out of. So it's kind of important. But for me, even in my story, when I was dealing with my own health issue, I asked my physician, should I change the way I'm eating? And he said that it doesn't matter. He looked me dead in my eyes and said, that's not important. And I just took that as at face value, and come to find out again, things are radically different. And your book really highlights that.
Well, it's interesting because Hippocrates, the father of all medicine, talked about food as our medicine. And that idea is now coming up really because the science is coming up. It's interesting you talk about, the pre-med requirements. Yeah, like we just get loaded on with heavy duty science. We got to get that under our belt in order to be able to get into school. And even in med school, I can tell you in residency training, everything else beyond that, nutrition's always been considered kind of like the lightweight subject and the one we don't have enough time for. And the truth of the matter is it's a subject we cannot not have. It is the subject that is the foundation of understanding our health. And if you don't understand health, really, you can't understand disease. So I think we're kind of going back to the wisdom of the ancients and but with real science behind it now.
Yeah, and that's what's so exciting, so exciting. And we're going to talk about some of these specific foods and nutrients today, but I think we need that foundational understanding, which you start with in the book and talking about these 5 defense systems. Because what people are going to learn today, we're talking about potentially helping you to prevent serious conditions and also supporting your body and being able to recover from some pretty serious things. So this is vital information, but we need to know about these 5 defense systems. So let's talk a little bit about each. And if we can, let's start with angiogenesis, because that's obviously one of the hallmark things you're known for.
Right. Well, so let's take one step back to say that, I'm sure all of your listeners think about health really as the absence of disease. You're not sick, you're healthy, right? Like that's the typical thing. You go for a checkup, you get the pat on the back, and you're like, man, I got out of that one lucky this time, right? That's what most people think. But we now know that health is a lot more than that. Good health is actually the result of our body's natural health defense systems that are hardwired inside us. And they protect us, these defenses, from the time we're born to our very last breath. When we get sick, it's usually because one or more of these health defense systems actually failed us, or they're getting weaker. And so that's really what got me interested in what is defining health itself. So we found 5 systems. There's probably more than that, but in my book, I write about 5 core foundational systems. First one is angiogenesis. So that's what I do. Angiogenesis is how the body grows blood vessels. Blood vessels are our circulation. That brings oxygen and nutrients to every single cell in our body. So it's a powerful way of nourishing, replenishing, and feeding our system. If our blood vessels aren't healthy, we're not healthy. So that's actually a powerful system that, guess what, can be boosted by foods Even though the biotech world has been working on drugs to manipulate the system, turns out Mother Nature's beat them to the punch by already creating lots of foods that can do it.
Mm. So I got a question. You map it
Yeah.
out. How much of these pathways, when we're talking about these blood vessels, how much do we have in our bodies?
Right. So it's amazing, how many blood vessels we have. 60,000 miles worth of blood vessels packed inside our skin. That's enough that if you were to pull them out end to end and line them up, that would encircle the earth twice. So really a powerful, lot of real estate there to help feed ourselves, feed our body.
Yes. So and there's a couple of things that related, and it really just set the light bulb off in my mind about this, because angiogenesis is related to normal things like wound healing and childbirth. So can you talk a little bit about that? Because there's also a potential dark side to it.
So, like almost everything else in life, there are sort of two sides to the coin. Normal angiogenesis feeds everything, but the way that we've evolved as humans is if we cut ourselves, our body knows that. Our defense system springs into action, figures out where the injury is, and starts growing blood vessels to heal it up. In fact, if you ever had a scab, scraped your knee, had a scab, that scab comes off a little too early, that bright red stuff underneath it, that's angiogenesis, new blood vessels growing to feed and heal that wound. So really, really important. But then when you're done healing, the body kind of turns it all down and right sizes it back to where it needs to be. For childbirth, every month, a woman who is of reproductive age grows a lining in her uterus called the endometrium. And that's what gets sloughed off during menstruation. And then it gets built right back up so that if there's a sperm that meets the egg, it has a nice nest, blood vessel nest to implant in so it can actually grow. So, and when the baby grows, you got the placenta and you've got the actual organs forming, that requires angiogenesis yet again. So we can't get away from angiogenesis. It is very much part of who we are. But as you point out, there's a dark side to it because diseases can hijack this process and feed themselves. And the best example of this is cancer. Cancers form all the time in our bodies, but they're completely harmless. They don't cause disease because normally they don't have a blood supply. So they can grow maybe 2 millimeters in diameter. It's about the size of the tip of a ballpoint pen. And that's it. They're frozen until your immune system spots them and wipes them out. But if they're able to actually survive long enough and release these natural chemicals, these proteins that are fertilizers that draw blood vessels, hijack the blood vessels to feed themselves, they can explode in size. In fact, once blood vessels reach a tumor, it'll grow 16,000 times in just a couple of weeks. So really deadly force. So harmless cancer, no blood vessels. Deadly cancer, filled with blood vessels. And that's why we're very interested, and that's what I gave my TED Talk on, is what are some foods that can actually cut off the blood supply feeding cancers?
Oh my goodness. And I want to dive in and talk about some of them now, because I mentioned earlier, turmeric is one of those that has this anti-angiogenesis properties to it. But you highlight so many in the book. It's just so mind-blowing.
Well, I'm very impressed that you know the mechanisms of turmeric, and also that you understand that black pepper and piperine actually work together to elevate those levels in the body. That's a pretty sophisticated concept, and not everybody knows it. So I'm glad you're getting the word out. But turmeric's one of the anti-angiogenic spices. There are other spices as well. But in my book, Eat to Beat Disease, I wanted to really help clear up confusion with science. And so there's probably no more confusing food than soy, right?
Yeah.
Women are being told everywhere that if they want to avoid breast cancer, they got to avoid soy. And so I addressed this in my book. What's the real truth? What's the science? Well, it turns out that soy is packed with a natural anti-angiogenic, cancer-starving substance. It's got, here's a little background about soy, the controversy. Soy's gotten a scary reputation because some people believe that the plant-based estrogen that's in soy can cause breast cancer. Well, we know that human estrogen can cause breast cancer, but it turns out, science tells us, plant estrogens are nothing like human estrogens, and in fact, they can counter their effects. How do we know this? Well, I write about a study of 5,000 women who have breast cancer, most vulnerable population, and this study showed that women with breast cancer, those who ate more soy, had about a 30% decrease in the risk of mortality, 30% lower. And how does it work? is that there's a natural chemical called genistein that's in soy that cuts off the blood supply, feeding not just breast cancers, but all cancers. How much do you need? The research has found about 10 grams of soy protein a day. That's what you'd find in a cup of soy milk.
That's so fascinating because for me, and this was about 10, even maybe 12 years ago when I started to hear, and there was nothing really to solidify this, but these phytoestrogens got lumped in with these xenoestrogens we might find in things like, plastic, bisphenol A or something like that. And we really didn't have this data that we have now to hear that, wait a minute, it's not fitting into those estrogen receptor sites in the human body the same way and causing these problems. Matter of fact, it's supportive. And that's really, really a breath of fresh air.
This is where science leads the way, right? Like, I think when it comes to food and health, it's so confusing to hear about a superfood or a super diet. And, like you hear it's curative 1 week and then the next week it flip-flops to the other side. If research scientists did that all the time with their medicines, we'd never know what to do. But what scientists do, what really serious doctors do, is we just follow the trail of science. It's like, the headlights shine forward and we just figure out what we're seeing within, in our windshield.
This leads me to asking you about, this is really, really, really interesting. It has anti-angiogenic properties, chicken thigh. Chicken thigh, we got to talk about this.
All right, man. Well, look, I love chicken thighs. I think chicken thighs are the tastiest part of a chicken. But, most people grow up being, kind of brainwashed that you got to have chicken breast, right? By the way, real chickens in the wild, their breasts are like this thin. I mean, these like chickens in the wild are like, they're not buff like you see a farm chicken.
They don't have the augmentation.
They don't have that augmentation. That's right. So, but chicken thighs actually are the dark meat, right? So dark meat's getting the exercise, and it turns out the chicken thighs accumulate a natural vitamin called vitamin K2. And, similar to other vitamins, they actually add something to the body. So in the case of vitamin K2, it's anti-angiogenic, and it actually cuts off the blood supply to tumors. And so there's, public health studies showing that people who eat diets containing vitamin K2, and chicken thighs is a great source of it, actually have lower risk of certain types of cancer.
Really, really remarkable. And again, you cite so many different interesting studies here in the book regarding this. And even with, you say here, quote, people who ate more K2 containing foods had more than 57% reduction in the chance of dying from heart disease. Really, really powerful stuff. So these nutrients don't just do one thing. And that's another thing that you share throughout the book.
That's right. Although, in the public domain, people tend to really simplify things into a message, like this compound does that, and that's all it does. In reality, Mother Nature is incredibly resourceful. So she generally gave lots of job descriptions to almost anything that's found in our food. And so this is why we need more research. But already we're beginning to learn the kinds of things that are present in food and how they act in the body.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So this is one of these, again, you got 5 defense systems. So this is one, angiogenesis. So let's move on and talk about stem cells. This is something that I literally, when I was reading this in the book, I was like, because I did a talk on this at a university literally 9 years ago and talking about pluripotent and multipotent stem cells and adult stem cells and this process. But now you've got so much more data and you've got it highlighted in the book. It just really spoke to my soul and how powerful this stuff is. So let's talk about stem cells.
Well, we're all made out of stem cells. So when our moms got together with our dads and started to create, the fetus that we started from, and as we grew in the womb, the only reason we're around is because our stem cells actually created us. So that's why it's part of your soul, because it's you and it's me. We're all made out of stem cells. The thing is that when we grow up, even as adults, we still have stem cells, some stem cells that are left. So if you take a look at 37 trillion human cells in the adult body, we got about 0.002%, small fraction. Actually, the absolute number is pretty big. It's about 74 million, of our cells still are stem cells, which means that they're hanging around waiting to actually fix and regenerate our bodies. Listen, when we were kids, we learned from our teachers that starfish and salamanders can regenerate, but people can't, right? That's what we all heard about. But science has turned that around. we now know that people do regenerate from the inside out and with these stem cells that are still left. It does it slowly, but that's what actually helps us heal and injure when we're injured, and also regenerate parts of ourselves, including our brain. In fact, there was a research study just just published just last week that just showed that, in fact, the adult brain actually still regenerates new neurons. So quite amazing what these things do. All right, part of our defense systems, obviously, very, very important. And it turns out that foods can actually enhance our stem cells, coax them out, help us repair ourselves, stimulate our own regeneration. And there are other foods that can actually damage them. And so this is actually another one of our defenses that very sensitive. We got to kind of treat them the right way, and then we can actually boost them whenever we need to.
Yes, yes. And so, as you mentioned, this is the beginning of life, egg, sperm, meat. Then we have this kind of explosion of activity with these stem cells. And these particular stem cells are able to diversify and become anything our bodies need. But as we develop, we start to have less and less of those type of stem cells and have more specialized stem cells. But if you could, can you share, where do our stem cells, as we grow into adults, where do they hide out, and how many do we have left? Because I would think that it's not one of the biggest resources that we have access to.
Yeah, they're sort of like diamonds hiding in the mountain, and most of them are living inside our bone marrow, right? So our bones are actually hollow. They're not actually filled with, they're not all bone all the way solid through. In the middle of a bone marrow are tons of cells, including blood cells, but mostly stem cells. And so those stem cells live in there like bees living in a hive, waiting for the time when they're actually needed. So on an average day, the body releases a few of these bees, these stem cells, into the circulation. They're conducting surveillance, figuring out what needs to be repaired, and doing their job. If you have an injury, though, whether it's surgery or trauma, if your heart's starved of oxygen with clogging, from cholesterol, then more stem cells will come pouring out, and they go right to the site of trouble. They're kind of like troubleshooters, right? Again, not many. They're like 0.002% of all of our cells are stem cells. So they're the minority of our cells, but they are powerful because, as you say, wherever they go, they know how to turn into that tissue or that organ.
Ah, that's so amazing. And if we really think about this, and I've done like a masterclass episode talking about the liver, we can lose like a third, even potentially 2/3 of our liver, and it's able to regenerate. Like, we have this capacity within us, but we don't think about it in terms of like how amazing and how good could this get potentially if we really understand what stem cells can do in regenerating, like you just mentioned, our brains, or, if somebody does lose a limb, for example.
Well, you know that our nerves actually regenerate at 2 millimeters a day. So you can take it out on a ruler, and if you actually had a problem with your arm, you can actually measure how much nerve you'll grow every single day to regenerate it. So think about the implication for the spinal cord, right? Or after a stroke. I mean, massive implications. But there are lots of biotech companies, Shawn, that are developing stem cell therapies where they're taking stem cells and processing them and trying to figure out ways to inject them back in for sickness. Again, we're back to that old model, which is a worthy one of looking for a sick person and figuring out how to actually inject a bullet back into them to wipe out a disease. I'm all for that. Okay. However, the amazing thing that I write about in my book is the science has also shown us that foods can actually help support and coax out our own stem cells. So we don't need to be injected. We can just eat the right things.
That's exactly what I want to talk about now. So I would love to talk about some of these foods and nutrients that are capable of, like you said, coaxing out and mobilizing these stem cells so our bodies can potentially be able to do these jobs that we've been talking about.
Right. Well, some of but this is a relatively new area of research. I'll tell you the most surprising one first. I think your listeners will like this, is actually dark chocolate. So, who needs another reason to like chocolate? But here's one that's really, really informed by science. So we know that really dark chocolate's made with cacao. Cacao is a natural substance that comes out of a bean. And inside those cacao beans are polyphenols, right? Really potent polyphenols. And so dark chocolate, which is usually 70% or higher, and you can just look at that number on the side of the chocolate bar you might find, darker the better, the higher the number, the more potent it actually is, actually can help mobilize those stem cells out of our bone marrow. There's a study I write about from UCSF in San Francisco, University of California in San Francisco, where they took patients with coronary disease. These are people that already had heart disease with narrowing of their arteries, and they gave them hot cocoa. So, just like made with dark chocolate, super dark chocolate, twice a day, and they had them drink that every day for a month, 30 days. And they looked at their blood from the beginning to the very end, and they found that the only thing they ever did was actually drink this cocoa. That's the only intervention. It doubled the number of stem cells in the same person from beginning to end. And it also improved their circulation, their blood flow. When they measured it using the same kind of tests that we use in a medical clinic or for biotech companies, actually doubled the activity of their blood flow. So this is quite an amazing story that, even something like chocolate, a small drink, it was only an 8-ounce cup twice a day, was powerful enough to do this. But there are other beverages that also can actually mobilize stem cells.
I had to keep my brain from popping out of my head right there. That's just nuts. That is incredible. That's so remarkable. Something so simple, and it's like super prevalent in our culture, but we're a little bit off. We're thinking in terms of the candy bar, but getting like the real thing, that closer to the natural state, the cacao, and then all the other things it has as well, because again, the food doesn't just do one thing. We also have a great source of magnesium and iron, so it can potentially help with anemia. And we've got precursors to neurotransmitters and hormones like serotonin and anandamide and tryptophan, all from chocolate. And the stem cell thing, it's just too much. I love it. I love it so much. So cool. So we've got the stem cells covered, and we talked about angiogenesis. So let's talk next about, and this one right here is super hot out there in the world of health and wellness. But here's the thing. I'm going to preface this for you. You say in your book, we are no longer simply human. Let's talk. Tell me what you mean by that.
All right. Well, there's a term called holobiont, Holobiont. And that word refers to an organism that's actually made up of smaller organisms or other multiple organisms to function as a whole. And that's what we are. We all call ourselves humans, but in fact, we're human cells mixed with bacteria cells. And those healthy bacteria, which is what we call the microbiome, and by the way, there's 39 trillion of those bacteria living inside our body, means that we're kind of an ecosystem. We're a big coral reef. Some of them are human cells and some of them are bacteria cells. And we collaborate in this ecosystem. We make one gigantic neighborhood that gets together. And like any neighborhood, when you've got good people in it, good cells, good bacteria, things work pretty well. Everybody's happy. And when you've got some bad players, bad actors, and that can happen in the body as well, you get some bad bacteria in that neighborhood, you wind up having a disrupted ecosystem, and you wind up having problems. And we're beginning to realize that a lot of health problems may actually be tracked back to problems in our bacteria. Our healthy bacteria aren't healthy anymore. So this is the new frontier for health, starts inside our gut with our bacteria.
So true. And one of the things that has been coming forward is the influence that our microbiome has on it's kind of like the big epigenetic influence. And we'll talk more about that in a moment. But knowing that, these microbes have genes as well. And if you take all their number, potentially has more genes than we do. And we think that we just have this one genetic lot that we've been given. And all of this stuff is so flexible and changeable. And our diet plays a huge role in this. And one of the specific bacteria that you talk about is Akkermansia. Can you talk about this one? Because as far as eating to beat disease and longevity, I think this is one that people are going to be hearing a lot about.
Right. So this Akkermansia is a bacteria that only has been discovered in the 90s. So it's really not one of these ancient bacteria that we've known about, since Louis Pasteur kind of thing. Right, like one of the earlier discoveries of microorganisms. It became important in my work because one of the things that actually has happened in medicine is that we now are beginning to treat cancer patients with something called immunotherapy. Immune therapies can actually really eliminate all cancer in a patient. by not killing the cancer directly, but by activating your own immune system and allowing your immune system, which is another one of our defenses, to search and destroy and figure out any of these bad cells that need to go away, right? That's what normally happens. I mentioned to you, like, I think we're all forming cancers all the time. You don't have angiogenesis, the immune system's got to wipe that out. But when we do have cancer, what we now know is that immune therapies can be given to cancer patients. These are FDA approved, or they've changed the way we even think about cancer. You can treat these patients with immune therapies, and it activates, lights up the immune system to wipe out the patients, wipe out the cancer. Now, some patients don't respond very well to these immune therapies, meaning the cancer doesn't actually shrink, doesn't go away, and it's one of the big mysteries on why. Well, a couple of years ago, a colleague of mine in Paris was speaking at a meeting that we had invited her. I had invited her to. Her name is Dr. Laurence Zipvogel out of Paris, and she's a brilliant immunologist who discovered in cancer patients who are getting treated with these immune therapies, that the difference between whether they would respond and do well to the treatment or not respond and not do well was one bacteria. And that one bacteria is Akkermansia. If you had Akkermansia, you did well. Your immune system was able to activate, and that just shows you how powerful the microbiome is. Like, they talks directly and facilitates our immune system. You didn't have it, man, game over. So here's the thing about Akkermansia: you can't eat it as a probiotic, right? So there's no, like, you can't go online and order the Akkermansia probiotic. The only way you can grow Akkermansia, Shawn, is with food. Turns out that pomegranate juice can actually change the gut in a way that the Akkermansia love to grow. Akkermansia love to grow in the mucus lining of the gut. When you have pomegranate juice, like real pomegranate juice, it'll actually grow that mucus lining, and within about a month, you can kind of double or triple the amount of Akkermansia that you need for your immune system.
Wow. That's nuts. Again, just so remarkable. And also Akkermansia is correlated with longevity, seeing folks that are living over 100 years having a higher ratio of that as well.
That's right. So, we're beginning to this is the new biology, right? Like, kids who are actually interested in going into science or medicine, today are going to be learning all this stuff as part of their, fundamentals. And for us, it's like new discoveries. So we're really at this golden age, I think, of discovering about the secrets of health.
Yes. So let's start to add in some pomegranates out there, and also pomegranate juice. But be careful with the kinds that's sweetened with sugar and things like that.
Because added sugar actually injures our microbiome.
Yeah.
The other thing I want to mention for your listeners about Akkermansia is that it's pretty vulnerable. Like, if you take a common antibiotic that will use for bronchitis, that everybody gives, that'll wipe out the Akkermansia pretty quickly. Wow. And so this is a bacteria that, we got to grow back, and that's why you got to keep on top of that.
Yeah. The body is so amazing, and there's so many different things going on. So not only is your body repairing, spell checking DNA mistakes and doing processes to, prevent angiogenesis to cancer cells, for example, and, defending your body against novel viruses, and the list goes on and on. It's all of these multifaceted roles, but in this role specifically, I would imagine that somebody with the severe COVID infection, for example, that their VEGF would probably shooting up pretty high, would be kind of another indicator that something's going on. What do you think about that?
Well, that's a great question. I'm not aware yet that we've actually studied circulating levels of VEGF in people with COVID. And in fact, you've actually sparked a new research idea, because we should be doing this, Shawn. We will document on your podcast. This is where this idea began, and we'll have to acknowledge it if it turns out into anything positive out of the research study. But I will tell you, we're still grappling with acute COVID infection. Obviously, we're trying to get vaccinated so we can prevent getting the COVID. But the other problem that's occurring is long COVID, or people who have gotten the infection and they seem like their lungs have gotten better, but then months later they wind up having all these same bizarre things all over again. head brain fog and smelling problems and racing heart, all kinds of muscle skeletal weaknesses. And, you know, we know that there's chronic inflammation. We know there's vascular damage. I've been studying that. And I'm wondering, maybe a biomarker for the damage actually would be high levels of circulating VEGF, because inflammation, not only cancer, but inflammation also triggers VEGF to come out. Because usually, and you think about it, we started talking about VEGF as a good guy. It is. You need it to build all the muscles. You need it to build your heart. You need to keep your circulation good. But in the case of disease, the body responds and sometimes gets tricked. And inflammation can cause a lot of VEGF to go out, which can also, cause chaos. Good idea.
Yeah, thank you. Yes. You know what? I just thought of something else, because in speaking about folks who come down with a severe case of this, and then they recover and they're kind of trying to battle back. I know there's so many different things that people just aren't aware of that can assist in that, because again, we're talking about healing vessels, blood vessels. We're talking about healing capillaries. This is where the real kind of mess is taking place and the body's trying to fix. What do you think about something like hyperbaric oxygen, for example, to aid in that?
You know, I've been thinking about this because I'm working with multiple groups now, trying to figure out how to help people who have survived COVID, but they're really struggling. And in some of the work I've done, we've been able to document literally people who are 6-9 months out of COVID. They're missing blood vessels, sometimes up to 50 or even 80% of their microcirculation. Those tiny little blood vessels in their lungs are missing, probably damaged by the virus itself. And how do you grow them back? Well, one of the things I've been thinking about is we need to heal up that injury caused by the virus, by COVID. And one of the things that we might be able to tear a page from the playbook of is wound healing. So hyperbaric oxygen is one of the tools that we use to be able to help people with chronic wounds that are not healing fast enough and they're at risk, to really prompt them to stimulate new blood vessel growth. And guess what hyperbaric does? Hyperbaric oxygen stimulates VEGF. It stimulates the superhero growth factor, the protein that grows new blood vessels. So I'm going to score 2 for you, because that's another way that might correlate with that growth factor as a biomarker in people who are actually trying to recover from long COVID, if we actually get hyperbaric on them.
When you put me in the study references, make sure to put that handsome guy for the Model Health Show, Shawn Stevenson.
Well, listen, I think you should be a co-author on it. I'll make you read the manuscript.
Absolutely. So now I think it's a good point for us to dive in and share some of the things that you shared with me that was just like so eye-opening and refreshing. But proactively, what can we do? Because for me, and you know this about me as well, and everybody listening, one of my fundamental principles, one of the big tenets that I'm trying to integrate into our culture is the fact that our bodies are literally made from the food that we eat, and also the ability to run processes is all dependent upon food. When we're talking about blood vessels, they're made from food. They're made from your food, the things you're consuming with, water, oxygen you're breathing. It's creating the cells themselves. This stuff matters so much, and it hasn't been a big part of the conversation. And we can just add some things in here, some health defense systems to be more on the offense, And so you shared some things with me as far as food that was just so powerful. And let's talk about some of those right now. What are some of the foods that we can be targeting and eating and integrating to really to help us to build up some more resistance and resilience during this time right now?
Well, listen, I mean, I think that if our body's health defenses are strong, that old adage of the best offense is a strong defense is really the lead that we should be all thinking about, every single one of us, whether you get the vaccine or not, whether you've had COVID or not, whether you're just, kind of going about your way. It doesn't matter your belief system. You got to believe in yourself, regardless of your philosophy. Your body can never lie to you, which means that when you're actually, your body's not, when you don't believe in your body, by the way, like ultimately the biggest religion that we can have, all of us, is really believing in ourselves and what we're actually made out of. And so that core, our cellular integrity, and our ability to be able to defend it is, in fact, what I think you were talking about. So what are some of the things that we can do, pandemic or not, but especially during a pandemic, that we can actually fortify our defenses? I'm going to come to the immune system at the very end. But because we were just talking about some of the damage that can occur when you get COVID in the lung and damaging blood vessels, or even in long COVID. By the way, people who have survived COVID but having these damages, they call themselves long haulers, like truckers that are driving across the country. Man, after 48 hours, still driving, still having this problem with COVID. That's what they call themselves. Long COVID is what the British were calling this, because they, English people like to put nice titles on things as much as possible. But the NIH recently created an official scientific and medical title for it. They call it PASC, or PASC. Now, and that stands for post-acute, meaning after you've already had, sequelae, meaning consequences of, what you had to deal with afterwards, COVID-19. So post-acute sequelae of COVID, PASC, is basically what some of these people are having. And because I told you we just had vascular damage, let's start with what we can do to protect our blood vessels, right? Good circulation, probably more resistant to virus infection, but definitely if it's been damaged, you want to be able to heal that baby up. So what are the things that can actually help us have a better vascular health defense system? We know that fruits and vegetables are actually healthy for us. And by the way, I don't know if you saw this, recently there was a major study that came out, looked at 2 million people and showed that exactly how many servings of fruits and vegetables you should have for optimal health. Turns out to be 2 servings of fruits per day and 3 servings of vegetables a day is actually what they just studied real world people and figured out that actually seems to optimize health. So what are some things about fruits? Because I actually really like fruits. It turns out that there is a natural substance called ursolic acid, and ursolic acid tends to be found in fruit skin. So in the fall, when I actually eat fruit, I love to eat the skin. It's got a lot of fiber in it, extra micronutrients. And by the way, this would be the kind of the situation where I would tell people, if you're going to have the fruit skin, you probably want to have organic or organic-like grown, because you don't want to have that pesticides on it. You can't scrub that off very easily. But ursolic acid actually stimulates, guess what? VEGF in your body to help grow blood vessels. So, this is like a whole story we're telling in this podcast. Like every point actually connects to another point, and that's really what health is all about. Fruit skins. Now, listen, you want to eat some fruit skins. You can eat a whole apple, and you can get a fair amount of fruit skin. But I'll give you your viewers and listeners a super simple tip of how to eat a lot of fruit skin. Create a trail mix with good healthy nuts, but have dried fruits in it. Dried cherries, dried cranberries, dried blueberries, dried apricots. That's a way of shrinking down a pretty big mass of fruit into tiny little things you can just pop. You can throw that down the hatch and get a lot of that fruit skin. So that would be one example of how we can do it. Barley is another example of a food that actually has this bioactive in it that actually stimulates angiogenesis. And mushrooms also have beta-D-glucan that can also help groom our vascular endothelium, those cells around our blood vessels, to keep it healthy.
Oh, that's perfect. So this is addressing one particular area, and it's incredibly insightful. And my son, Jordan, he's a personal trainer now. He's creating his own programs, helping people, working with kids. It's amazing. One of the things that he's always doing on social media is showing people the unique ways that you can eat fruit. So he's like eating the whole kiwi, which you would think just to peel off that kind of fuzzy skin. But, this is another thing that you could take advantage of.
Yeah, that's right. There's all kinds of little tips. One of the things that I love about food. So I always tell people, I'm not one of these doctors that rejects modern medicine, and I somehow got on the veggie craze, so I stand up on a podium and wave a kale leaf. I'm not one of those guys. Actually, I helped to develop biotech drugs, so I'm a big believer in the right medicine for the right person at the right time. That's important, but the missing tool in the toolbox is our diet and our food. When it comes to food, I tell people I actually love food. I wouldn't say I love eating, like I'm not I don't love stuff in my face, but I love food. I love food, Shawn, because it tells us something. Everybody's got a connection to food. It's intimate. Food tells us something about our upbringing, how we grew up, what we remember, our earliest memories with our families, our moms, our kitchens we grew up in, the smells when we were coming back from school. It tells us something about our families, our communities, our culture. And so everybody has this very complicated, very personal, intimate connection with food. And that's the great thing about it, is that you can always explore something new about how to eat foods. And if you're someone who's like me, curious about cultures, you can go out and explore new cultures. It's like, and in today's digital world, you can pick up a food that you don't know much about. Like, I'll give you one, bitter melon. The heck is a bitter melon? Well, it's a Southeast Asian, it's kind of like a cucumber. It's a little hairy. It's got grooves in it. And if you were to eat it and taste it, and you don't know how to prepare it, man, is that thing bitter. But if you want to actually skin it, seed it, chop it up, put it in some vegetable stock, slowly simmer it to soften up the melon, okay? And then cook it with some fish or some chicken, and that animal protein complements the bitterness, and cooking it mellows the whole thing out. Guess what that turns out to do? It actually stimulates your stem cells, protects your DNA, and boosts your immunity at the same time. And guess what? Bitter melon has always been a traditional medicinal food in Southeast Asia. Like, man, I love that kind of stuff. And you can go on YouTube and search bitter melon recipe, and you can watch somebody cook it for you.
So good. Yeah. I haven't thought about bitter melon in quite some time. That's one of those foods that also has some benefit with insulin resistance, for example.
Exactly.
That's the thing too, is like, it's typically not just one thing that a food is good for, because your body is not compartmentalized. If it's good for one thing, it's probably good for a lot of other things. You said something to me the other day when we were talking about broccoli sprouts that really tripped me out. Can you share that?
Yeah, well, so another immune system, defense system that we want to boost these times is our immune system. And so one of the first things I did at the beginning of the pandemic was go back to my playbook to say, okay, so what can actually amp up that front line of defense, right? We're talking about those sentries, that passport control that can prevent viruses from coming in. Well, here's what I did. I figured out, well, we didn't have a vaccine at the time, but I wanted to know what actually can naturally kind of not vaccinate yourself, but to ramp up those natural defenses. And it turns out that sulforaphanes, which are a class of chemical that taste a little sulfury, by the way, that's what kale, broccoli, cauliflower, they've got a lot of that sulfury kind of a little taste to it, actually. It's kind of the part of the palate, let's say, a palate stimulator. That broccoli, actually, adult broccoli, the treetops and the trunks, they have a lot of it. And I thought, that's really cool, because I had done research looking at the biological properties of broccoli, and we tested the treetops versus the stems, and we found the treetops are very active. We found that there was twice as much activity in the stem. So I thought, well, okay, maybe I should be eating some broccoli stem. But then I started to take a look further, and I was blown away by something, Shawn, which is that as much as broccoli stems have of these sulforaphanes, those are grown-up broccolis, that baby broccoli sprouts, we're talking about 3 to 4 day old broccoli. You can see them in the markets now, like just a regular supermarket. If you go to the sprouts section, I remember they used to have just only like bean sprouts. Now they got all kinds of sprouts, alfalfa, broccoli. The broccoli sprouts are just grown up. They're 3 to 4 days old. You buy them up, and you got to kind of peel them apart. They're kind of like it's like turf, like astroturf a little bit. Peel them apart, wash them up, and you eat them. They don't taste like broccoli. Actually, they taste nutty, which I love. I love a little kind of nutty flavor. It's unexpected, honestly. And you can sprinkle on almost any food that you're actually preparing. It makes it taste a little bit better. But here's the crazy thing. The sulforaphanes that are in adult broccoli, the baby ones have 100 times the concentration. It's almost like the broccoli was born with all the sulforaphanes it's ever going to have. all right, and then a little tiny little sprout, and as it grows up and extends and turns into this gigantic thing, right? Think Jolly Green Giant, right? It's big. It distributes all the broccoli, the sulforaphanes that started in the entire body of the broccoli. So broccoli sprouts have a lot of sulforaphanes, and then here's really the kind of the punchline. Turns out research has been done showing that if you drink a shake made out of broccoli sprouts, a couple of shakes actually a day, and just a cup of broccoli sprouts put into a shake, and then you get actually a flu vaccine. So this isn't COVID. This is just regular old, garden variety flu vaccine, which everybody should get. And you also drink the broccoli sprout shake. The broccoli sprouts will amp up your body's response to a vaccine 22 times. So you wind up going kind of like ordinary vaccine responder to super soldier yourself. You just like really amp your defenses. And when they actually studied in these people, these are young people, healthy people, their T cells and natural killer cells, they were amped up beyond, and more defense cells, immune cells, and more killing power within each of those cells against the virus. And then when they actually swabbed to look for viruses, right? So, like everybody was like, oh my God, not the COVID swab in your nose. But when you do research, you actually do swabs to just look for influenza, just a regular flu virus. We don't have to go deep, just go even in a regular nose. People who are on a placebo drink, so this is a placebo-controlled study, still had flu virus in their nose, but in the broccoli drinkers, shake drinkers who got the vaccine, zero, Z. And so this is sort of like the proof of concept of just how powerful Mother Nature is, and our body can respond to it in equally powerful ways.
Incredible. All right, I know we're getting tight on time here, but I would love if you could share with these health defense systems. There's 5 that we need to target, and there's a lot more that you can learn from Dr. Lee, and we'll talk about that in a moment. But if there's maybe 1 or 2 more foods that we need to target right now to help with our body's defense systems.
Yeah, well, look, I mean, let's go through 5. Okay, so angiogenesis, we talked about fruit peel to help endothelial cells stay healthy. Immune system, we talked about broccoli sprouts. Let's talk about regeneration, stem cells. It turns out that cacao, dark chocolate, the stuff, not the sweet stuff, the stuff that's actually kind of slightly bitter, comes from Mother Nature, comes from a pod, actually can double the number of stem cells in your bloodstream if you have the equivalent of dark chocolate, like 80% or higher. So it's pretty bitter. I actually like it. And you have it as hot chocolate twice a day. Research has shown you can take people with cardiovascular disease, impaired blood flow, and you can drink that and it'll mobilize your stem cells. You can actually measure it with a blood test, right? Like the kind of blood test you go to your doctor's office. Instead of looking for the usual suspects in a blood test you look for stem cells. You can double the number of stem cells in your body by just drinking dark cocoa, 80% or higher, for 30 days. And then you double the body's ability to healthy your blood vessels because they've been repaired, regenerated. That's stem cells, all right? Now, that did that for your blood vessels. Think about what it did for your brain. Think about what it did for your heart. Think about what your kidney, your liver, and by the way, your skin and your hair and all that other kind of stuff, important. So that's the third defense system. Let's talk about microbiome, something that people might not have expected because, all right, look, I mean, if I were to meet expectations, what am I going to say about the microbiome? Have some fermented foods. Go ahead and have some yogurt, sauerkraut, kimchi, all that kind of stuff. Absolutely, do that. But what about kiwi? What if I told you, because you talked about kiwi earlier, made me think about it. Now, what if I told you that kiwi is a great source of vitamin C, which is good for your immunity and lowering inflammation, but it's got a lot of fiber in it, and a surprising amount of fiber in just the green stuff. If you eat the skin, it's got a ton of fiber, but just the green stuff actually has a lot of fiber. You can taste it when you're eating a kiwi. If you actually chew it, you can taste the fiber, although it kind of goes down really easily. Turns out eating just 1 kiwi a day will quickly start to change the number of healthy gut bacteria in your body. And it only takes like 24 hours to cause that benefit. And so this is a quick, I wouldn't call it a fix, but it is a quick way of getting your gut to actually repair itself. And so Microbiome, kiwi. Now let's go for DNA repair, because I love the idea of DNA, of fixing your DNA, your like own gene therapy. Here's something that most people will take them like by surprise. There's a lot of things, like antioxidants, do all that kind of stuff. What if I told you that sunflower seeds can actually slow down the degradation of your telomeres? So these are the life fuse, that thing that protects your DNA, okay, that burns down slowly as we get older, and you want to slow that burn down. Okay, who wants to get older? We do all we want to age great. And we want to make sure as we're aging, our DNA is not burning down too fast. What are things that happen as we age and our DNA gets shorter? Our hair starts to fall out, starts to turn gray, our skin gets wrinkly, our heart function gets less vibrant and powerful as before, so we tend towards heart failure. Our eyesight goes down. Our retina, the neuroretina, which receives light, transmit to our brain, starts to fade. What's the common denominator of aging in all of those cell types? Is our telomeres are getting shorter and shorter and shorter and shorter. Remember that powder keg I was telling you about? When you get down to the powder keg, man, game over, right? You can't run away from that blast far enough. And so basically what you want to do is slow that fuse down. It turns out that sunflower seeds can actually naturally slow down telomere degradation. And so that's another one. So 5 health defense systems. I'm trying to see if I can remember this quickly. Angiogenesis, dried fruit, regeneration stem cells, dark chocolate, microbiome, kiwi, DNA, sunflower seeds, immunity, broccoli sprouts. Listen, I write about more than 200 different foods, but I was trying to bring up some stuff that most people might not have thought about for this podcast.
So many good ones, and also throwing in here some insights about bitter melon and VEGF throughout the episode. So many incredible things. And Dr. Lee actually has a deep dive into all of these different health defense systems that people can get access to. And number one, this is something coming from a researcher, scientist like Dr. Lee. This is something to share with our friends and families, something to share with our parents right now, in particular our grandparents, who, again, when we talk about this level of susceptibility, really, what are the things that we can do to address all 5 of those health defenses? And so I would imagine that ferments would be something important to add in, maybe even something like kimchi.
Well, it's amazing to know that kimchi is fermented and is rich with bacteria. And it's been known for more than 20 years that people that eat kimchi actually have a stronger immune system. We're putting bacteria in them. And in fact, kimchi itself has its own unique kimchi type of bacteria, and it's been shown to actually fight the flu. But kimchi isn't the only thing. Some people love kimchi. I love kimchi, but not everybody likes it. So how about sauerkraut? Right? Flip to the other side of the world, and you actually have pickled, cabbage, and that actually contains healthy bacteria as well. Keep going back. Now you go to Asia, and there's something called pao cai, which actually you find like in the Chinese restaurant, they'll put a little bit of these pickled vegetables at the beginning of a meal, also made with fermented bacteria. And what's also interesting is that we're discovering that even bread and cheese, which are made with bacteria, can be helpful. In fact, I like to talk about, there's this whole anti-carb thing out there, but as you pointed out yourself, it's not all or nothing with one thing. Foods are complicated. And one bread that's really interesting is pumpernickel bread. That brown bread, it's made with rye flour, and the rye flour actually lowers a harmful bacteria that grows in the gut that actually releases a toxin that causes inflammation. And so by eating rye flour bread, you can actually lower that bacteria and lower inflammation. On the other hand, sourdough bread, some people really love sourdough bread, is made with a bacteria called Lactobacillus reuteri. Now, Lactobacillus, the lactic acid is actually what makes the sourdough bread tangy. That's a good part of the bread. That bacteria is normally found in the gut, our healthy gut, and it boosts our immune system, helps us do healing, and it actually communicates to our brain and prompts our brain to release the hormone, the social hormone oxytocin, which is the feel-good hormone we get when we get a hug from somebody we love.
I love this so much because we're getting a whole story, you know. I haven't heard pumpernickel said in so long. When I hear it, I think that's like something in a Disney movie, right? That's the bread a fairy would eat, right? Pumpernickel. And then we've got the sourdough as well, and understanding we've got like this kind of fermented capacity to it and the ability to literally produce more oxytocin. But being mindful, you know, for some folks, that's not going to resonate with you. And for other folks, this can be a potentially healing food for you. So again, just keeping our minds open and looking at the research and also testing things out, because one of the things you also encourage is for folks to try things and go for the things that they enjoy, because you're giving them permission to eat the foods and some of the beverages that they enjoy as well, but just doing this a little bit more intelligently.
Right. Now, my emphasis is on what you should add to your diet, not what you should eliminate or take away. Because, you know, listen, human nature abhors deprivation. You know, how many times have you heard it said, if you can't do something, your mind automatically says, well, maybe I should want to do it. But on the other hand, also these deprivation diets are really difficult to stick to. And what we need to do is think about patterns that actually we can stick to our whole lives, from the time we're kids to when we're really old. We ought to be able to actually stick to something that we love. And so in my book, I show more than 200 foods. Look through those foods, circle the ones you already like, and choose those next time you're going out to go shopping or ordering from a restaurant, because then you're already ahead of the game because you're picking the things you already love.
Love it, love it, love it. One more thing I want to ask you about before we move on from the microbiome is the importance of, it's something that the microbiome does for us that we don't really talk a lot about, and this is producing these short chain fatty acids. So can you please just give people a little bit of information on that?
Right. So bacteria in our gut don't just sit there. They're pretty active, but they're also eating things and feeding themselves. So think about your goldfish in an aquarium, right? You drop some flakes in there and they go down into the goldfish, and the goldfish eat them up, and you see all these little particles that come out of the fish's mouth. Anybody's had a fish bowl will remember that. Well, that's exactly what the microbiome does. So when we feed them fiber, for example, soluble fiber, we're feeding the bacteria are eating these fibers, and they're creating little particles, little fragments from the fiber. And some of these fragments are called short chain fatty acids, or SCAFAs. But they are not just crumbs that drop to the bottom of the aquarium. In fact, they actually dissolve right out of the gut, get into our bloodstream. And again, Mother Nature, being very resourceful, has figured out these short chain fatty acids, what the bacteria cut up that fiber into, actually can have a function. So it's anti-inflammatory, it's immune boosting, it actually can be pro-angiogenic as well as anti-angiogenic. There's different types and different sizes of these fragments. And so they're kind of invisible, but the bacteria know exactly how to make them.
Awesome, awesome. So of these 5 defense systems, we've talked about angiogenesis, we've talked about regeneration via stem cells, the microbiome. Next up, you talk about DNA protection. Right.
So who hasn't heard about DNA, right? Ancestry.com, 23andMe, take a cheek swab, figure out who you're related to or what kind of risk you have. All very important, right? The human genome, when we actually sequenced the human genome, that was like a milestone in human history. We finally sort of hacked into our genetics, they say. Well, here's the other thing. We're always trying to be smart, as scientists, to figure out what's going on. But in fact, Mother Nature and evolution is a lot smarter than we can ever be. And the DNA is not just the genetic code that makes proteins in our body, but in fact, it actually protects us against the environment. What do I mean by that? Well, look, anybody who's ever sat in traffic for a long time, on a sunny day, you're getting sunshine pouring in through your windows, or you're out at the beach, and you're not wearing enough sunscreen, you get ultraviolet radiation, DNA damage, mutating your skin. Anybody who's ever smelled secondhand smoke, I hope people don't smoke, but if they don't smoke, even if you smell it from somebody else, that's DNA damage. That just smelling that will damage your DNA in your lungs. Or how many people fill up their car at the filling station, right? Do you stand upwind or downwind of the hose? If you can smell that fuel, DNA damage. The good news is that your body, the DNA, it knows how to protect itself. So it fixes itself, rebuilds itself, it caps itself off with the telomeres. It does a lot of things to protect itself. You called it epigenetics. These are all mechanisms that really help us maintain our functionality of our DNA. And the great news is that foods can actually influence that process.
Let's talk about some foods that can do that.
Well, one of the foods that you talked about earlier, turmeric, is actually a great DNA modifier. So basically, turmeric can uncloak DNA that is useful and even fight even cancer fighting DNA to unleash the protective DNA to help fight cancer. And it can also cap some of the DNA that, might actually not be so helpful as well. And so that's one example of a spice that we can add to our food. Oh yeah, don't forget to add it with fresh cracked black pepper if you're actually using it for cooking. But those two ingredients are really important together. But I want to tell you some things that are like not as well known, like for example, kiwi fruit, right? Everybody's seen a kiwi. It's like this monkey ball shaped thing, furry. Cut it down the middle, open it up. It's got this bright green flesh, really juicy and sweet. It's packed with vitamin C and other vitamins. And there have been studies in humans, clinical studies, in which they've actually taken young people and measured their blood at the beginning and looked at their DNA, how well it does, how well it can protect itself. And then they gave them one kiwi and they ate them. And they measured after a couple of days that eating that one kiwi can protect their DNA, increase it by 60%. So you can just eat one kiwi a day and it pops up your defense mechanisms. If you eat 3 kiwis a day, it helps your DNA rebuild itself. So it actually repairs itself. So, here's a simple, lowly kiwi fruit, like I might have one for breakfast, for example, that can actually do a lot for you.
Wow. And shout out to New Zealand, where kiwis originated. And we got some great listeners there as well. When you said monkey ball looking thing, I was like, what? I almost laughed out loud. It's like, the doctor's monkey ball looking thing? So kiwis are something for us to add in, protecting our DNA. But I would love if you talk about a little bit about the telomeres. This is something that I've highlighted several times on the show, but now we've got even more data. And it's really, it's remarkable because this might be the best biological marker we have for how long we're going to live potentially. And our lifestyle, food choices can affect our telomeres, whether they get shortened or whether we can activate telomerase and potentially grow some back.
Right. So think about your DNA like yarn. That's like a big string, a big lump, a big pile of yarn. You're going to wind that yarn up, right? So you wind it around something. And that's really what our chromosomes are. Our DNA is wound up into these X's and Y's that are packed inside our cells. That's really our genome packed into chromosomes. And at the very end, you can imagine if you're winding up a ball of yarn, you got to be able to get that yarn so it doesn't unravel to stick. And so you got to put a cap on it. The cap is the telomere. Physically, it kind of looks like the plastic tip on the end of a shoelace, kind of protects it and holds the thing to prevent it from unraveling. That protective cap on our DNA is part of our protection. Longer the telomere, longer we think we're going to live. Cellular aging. Shorter the telomere, the shorter these cells are going to live. And so one of the big areas of research right now, by the way, this research led to the Nobel Prize a few years ago, is what can we actually do to lengthen our telomere? So for those people that are, sort of the Ponce de Leon people looking for the fountain of youth, everybody's looking for things that actually keep our telomeres longer. Well, the answers are from research that I write about in my book might actually be already in our kitchens. So, for example, coffee turns out to be a beverage that actually can not just prevent our telomeres from burning down like a fuse, it actually can lengthen the telomeres as well. So that's really quite an amazing thing that coffee can actually do that. But actually, it's probably more dietary pattern. And people that have good dietary patterns tend to be generally healthier. They tend to exercise and sleep better and all that kind of stuff. But the Mediterranean diet is one of the best examples of a whole food, primarily plant-based diet with healthy oils, seafood, and relatively low red meat and minimal processed foods. That combination tends to lengthen telomeres. And so that's really one of the amazing things. I have a colleague, Dr. Dean Ornish. He and I worked together on looking at sort of healthy patterns of diets. And we actually found, in fact, that healthy diets like the Mediterranean diets not only actually lengthen telomeres, but also at the same time, again, Mother Nature being very efficient, actually are also anti-angiogenic that can protect you against cancer. So something that's good for the goose is probably good for the gander.
Yes, absolutely. And by the way, everybody, when he talked about that end cap on a shoelace, I was doing a talk for high school students, and this was maybe 8 years ago. And one of the students, and we were talking about telomeres, you know, it was like a science conference thing. And one of the students was like, those are called aglets. And I was like, what? Is that real? Is that true? It has a name, and they're actually called aglets. So telomeres are like aglets. And we all know what it's like when we don't have those on the end of our shoestrings and they get frayed. It is like the worst thing. You like try to put some spit on it and twist it up. It's just terrible. You don't want your DNA to unravel like that, you know? So thank you for sharing that. It's such a powerful thing. And we're just learning so much more about this. And I didn't know about this coffee thing. That's super remarkable. And big shout out to folks who are, you know, going for the good stuff. All right. We're not getting the McCafe. We're getting some good, organic, high quality coffee and can do a lot of benefit for you. So we've covered 4 of the 5 defense systems, and there's one more. And I don't think any more is more important than this one as well. So let's talk about the immune system.
Right. So every grandmother's told their grandkids that you got to protect your immune system, right? If you don't have a good immune system, you're going to get sick. So we know the immune system protects us against infection, but we now know that the immune system also protects us against cancer and other serious diseases as well, as we talked about a little bit earlier. So what are some of the things that can activate the immune system besides drugs? I mean, there's a lot of things that can actually help our immune system, but food, you know, is really a pretty powerful way to enhance it. We talked a little bit earlier about kimchi boosting our immune system through the microbiome, but there are foods that just can actually automatically boost our immune system by themselves. One of them is mango. You know, I love mangoes. They're juicy, sweet, filled with fiber. They got lots of vitamins, and they also have bioactives. And I call a mango, by the way, a
stone fruit.
Well, mango is a stone fruit, but I call mangoes and stone fruit grand slammers of foods. These are foods, a whole table of foods I have in my book that all activate all 5 defense systems at the same time, including the immune system. So you can slam it out of the park by eating these foods. Mango is one of my favorites. Tasty, juicy, sweet. You get vitamins, good minerals, and it actually contains these natural bioactives that actually can help boost your immune system. But it's not just mangoes. You got other things. Broccoli sprouts. You know, some people talk about living foods, right? Those are the young sprouting foods that have all the nutrients and the energy when they're just young babies. And later on, when they get older, they get distributed the energy on the whole bigger plant. Well, it turns out that broccoli sprouts have been studied to see if they can boost the immune system. And in my book, I talk about a research study where they gave young people in their 20s the flu shot. Actually, it's not a shot. They gave a flu inhaler to protect them against the flu. And it turns out that if they gave them also a couple of shots of broccoli sprouts made into a smoothie, that's it, a couple of shots of this a day, that you would actually improve the response like 20 times to the benefit protecting you against the flu. Boost your immune system. And when they even swabbed their noses afterwards, you know, where the virus might live, they were like almost all gone. And so again, this is an example of a food that can boost up the immune response that we want to have to protect ourselves. So, you know, you go to the doctor, you get a flu shot, but, you know, what about having a smoothie made with broccoli sprouts as well? Final food I want to talk about is really mushrooms. So, you know, some people love mushrooms, some people don't, but everybody should love them because, number one, they grow right from the ground. They suck up all those really nice nutrients from the ground. If it's growing in clean ground, we've got to protect our earth, have a good planet so that our food is really safe. But inside the mushroom, there is a natural compound called beta-glucan, that is found in the cap of the mushroom that we cut up, right, and eat, and that stimulates the immune system directly. But here's a real surprise. And regardless of whether it's a shiitake mushroom, a maitake mushroom, a portobello mushroom, or even the lowly white button mushroom, you know, the ones that are they're not expensive at all. You can find them anywhere. But here's like the surprise, and I write about this in a book. The part of the food matters. So how many of us buy mushrooms and you cut off the tops and you're cooking with those, and you take those stems, you just toss them out? I think most people do that. Not everybody. But researchers have found that the stems, called the stipe, actually contains up to 3 times more beta-glucan than the cap. Wow. Cap is good, stems better. Next time you eat mushrooms, eat them both.
Wow, that's so cool because we actually, when we're making mushrooms, we use a stem as well. So, and it was
Yeah.
just like, there's got to be some good stuff in here. But now I know. That's so cool, so cool. So again, there's a wealth of I think you said 250 different foods.
200 some foods. I got more than 200 foods in there.
And it's just going to blow your mind. And to hear the research, and we could just geek out all day on this stuff. But there are a couple I've got to ask you about before I let you go, because this is where we get into a little bit of like a little controversy, how much do we do, And I want to talk about, you've got red wine in here. What's going on with red wine? How does that make the cut?
Well, most of the studies involving public health looking at red wine have shown, surprisingly, that there's some benefits. Benefits your heart, lower risk of cancer, and other types of metabolic diseases as well. But the reality is that it's not the alcohol. It's never the alcohol that's actually the good stuff for you. I mean, alcohol might loosen up our nerves and make us feel a little bit better. But in fact, the good stuff that activates our health defenses came out of the grape skin. And that's why red wine is red, is it extracted out that natural dye and all those other good things that come out of it. Same thing as beer, by the way. The hops in the beer elaborate a natural chemical called xanthohumarol, and that floats up right into the beer. So, there's actually benefits of beer, mobilizes your stem cells, actually is anti-angiogenic as well. Lots of good reasons, but it's not the alcohol. So what I would say is that this is an example of how research really allows us to peel the layers back to figure out why something is beneficial and what is it.
I'm looking around. My team is all smiling after you said the beer thing. Eyes are lighting up. So in the book, you mentioned a study. It says that individuals who drank 1.5 to 2 beers per day were found to have a 60% reduction in the risk of dementia. Unbelievable, because we usually associate beer to messing up your brain, but it's that dose that's effective versus when we get into having too much alcohol. And you even mentioned that as well. At high doses, it's brain toxin. And this is the thing, if you're having a beer or two versus a 12-pack, the results are going to be radically different.
Right. I mean, the poison is always in the dose. I mean, you can poison yourself just by drinking water. There's water toxicity. And so one of the things that I emphasize in my book is it's important to have moderation. The human body wasn't built to be stuffed. You go to a buffet line, you can eat anything you want, as much as you want. My recommendation is take, only about a third of what your brain tells you to take and put it on your plate. Enjoy what you're eating, choose the right things, and lean into the foods that you love.
Perfect. I want to ask you about one more because I'm a huge fan of this. And I've even recently gotten more into the green teas because I'm a big fan of mushroom elixirs and teas and, yerba mate and even black teas. But I've been getting more into the matcha lately. I've been really digging that. And so one of the things you talk about is EGCG being one of those really powerful nutrients that we find in sources like green tea. So
the tea plant, which grows in a bush, is picked a couple of times a year in places that actually have tea. Tea doesn't grow in bags on a plant.
Right.
It comes as little leaves, and they people that pick these leaves and they dry them out in the sun, and then in the case of matcha, they grind them into a powder. So in fact you're drinking the whole leaf, which is why it's more potent. But if you're just brewing the tea, it's the leaf that kind of sticks around inside the tea bag or sits at the bottom of the cup. I just drink tea with whole leaves, and all the good stuff kind of just is coaxed out of the tea leaf or out of the powder into the liquid, which we then drink. So EGCG is one of hundreds of natural compounds, natural chemicals that are found in tea leaves, but it seems to be one of the most potent. It's certainly been the most researched. It inhibits angiogenesis. It helps protect our blood vessels from heart disease. It might actually lower our blood pressure, protect us against high cholesterol in the blood. Probably coaxes out stem cells as well. A lot of reasons to love green tea. Here's the surprise that I write about in my book. I found it was surprising myself. I'm glad you mentioned matcha. It turns out that matcha And probably the high levels of EGCG in matcha actually can kill cancer stem cells. So while most of the stem cells we have are good and help regenerate ourselves, when a cancer grows, they also have their own stem cells. And those stem cells keep that cancer coming back, right? Those are really deadly. That's the holy grail of cancer research, is trying to find a way to kill those cancer stem cells. Just this past year, researchers found that matcha and the EGCG in it can kill the cancer stem cells in breast cancer. So another reason to like matcha.
So remarkable, so remarkable. Dr. Lee, this book is just out of this world, and so are you. And if you could, I know in the book you've got your 5x5x5 framework. You've got so many other little insights and tips for people. But for everybody listening, what is something that you want to make sure that you let them know about Eat to Beat Disease and why everybody should have this book in their hands?
I have one very simple take-home message from reading my book, is that you can now focus your efforts on what and figuring out what to add to your diet. More good things you add in, you got less room for bad things. And, we're all human. Life's not perfect. We can't always eat all the perfect, the things that we know are good for us. But if you have more stuff that's good for you, you'll kind of you'll hip check out the things that are not so good for you. And on the balance, that's what health is all about. It's all about a balance. We want to have more good than the bad, and then we're actually going to be in the kind of shape that we want. It's not about extremes. It's about reasonableness. And so this is an entirely new way to think about our health. And so, you can buy my book, Eat to Beat Disease, anywhere that books are sold. And I'm actually, posting stuff all the time on social. So it's at Dr. William Lee, L.I. I'm on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. And what I really would love to have people do is to come sign up and join my community on my website. And then I can update you personally. And it's drwilliamleeli.com. And I'm just going to come up with new recipes and new ideas for people. This science is like pounding out. And so I put everything I possibly could in the book, but then you got to send it to the printers and it's got to print a book. And so it's ongoing stuff is coming out. You can get it on my website.
Hey, if you like this video, make sure to check out this video right here to up-level your health today. Oftentimes when you have an injury or an issue like this, we're told not to do anything. That's often the worst thing you can do, because things will start to atrophy. If you don't use it, you lose it.